This is Basic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
This software is probably one of the most expensive pieces of software sold that ran on the Atari. So we sold systems to companies like IBM. We sold to JC Penney. We've sold them to the Defense Intelligence Agency, the government.
I'm Kevin Savitz, and this is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. Compu Prompt was the first electronic personal computer-based teleprompter, which ran off an Atari 800XL computer. It was created by Courtney Goodin, who won an Emmy Award for it for pioneering development in electronic prompting. Mr. Goodin also created the Atari graphics programs Color Print and Graphic Master, both of which were distributed by Datasoft. This interview took place on December 4th, 2015.
Where are you located, Kevin?
Portland, Oregon. How about you?
You're on the West Coast. So, yeah, I'm in Hollywood.
Oh, nice.
Hollyweird.
Hollyweird. Excellent. I recently saw an eBay listing for your Compu Prompt product. I'd never heard of it before. I was intrigued, and I thought we could talk about it, how you created it, and just kind of get the story.
Sure. You want to start?
Sure. So, okay, I understand that Compu Prompt was the first electronic personal computer-based teleprompter. Is that correct?
That's right. I guess Compu Prompt started. I had written some Atari software before that. I had got involved with computers, in the early '70s, and when the Atari came out in '79, I immediately jumped on it because it was one of the first. I think my first computer was a Radio Shack Model 1, but it didn't have very extensive graphics or anything. So. And I was working in the business as a production sound mixer on television shows, commercials, mainly commercials, and a few movies. That was my main profession, and computers was pretty much my hobby. I had written a couple of. Once I got the Atari 400, and then I got an Atari 800 8-bit machine, and I thought, this was a fabulous thing to be used as a tool. Now, I never wrote any games or anything or developed any software along that line. All I ever wrote was productivity software. And I had written probably around 1980, 81, I wrote one of the first graphics editors for the Atari called Graphic Master. And that was licensed through Datasoft. They distributed that, and then I came up with a unique program called Color Print, which was the first, the first color printer program for a personal computer, and that was unique because there were no color printers at the time, and it allowed
kind of an impediment to sales.
Yeah, well, here's how it worked. It was kind of ingenious. I was creating all these great graphics on the Atari, and I had written Graphic Master, which was like one of the first graphics editors, which lets you cut and paste and manipulate graphics in different modes on the Atari in the mode 7 and mode 8. If people that know the Atari, and which was mode 8 was the high res, quote unquote high res, and so I created all these, and I had to write the printer drivers for that because the only printers that were out there were the Epson MX80 and there was an NEC. There were dot matrix printers. So I wrote that, and then I was kind of frustrated that I had all these color images, but could only print them out in black and white. So I developed a method using the MX80 and tractor feed to use colored carbon paper and make a sandwich, the color carbon paper, and my software did the color separations of the Atari screens that were saved on disk. And you'd run the paper. You'd make a bifold sandwich with the carbon paper in the middle, and you'd run it through 3 times and do 3 color separations, or 4 if you wanted to.
With red, green, and blue, and then the option in black?
Red, green, blue, and black.
Oh.
And
wow.
So the top sheet would have the accumulation of all the colors in black, and then the bottom sheet would have the color printing. And the registration was almost good enough to, you had to go through and index it each time and start it at the same place at the top of the page. But, it was it actually worked. And so to sell that, Datasoft was marketing it. And they had to come up with, we didn't sell a lot of them because we had a hard time obtaining the colored carbon paper. You had to get red, green, and blue carbon paper, which was pretty unusual. And so, anyway, so I had some background in writing graphic stuff on the Atari. And,
so who sold this color print before we moved on? Who sold
Datasoft, which was Datasoft was an 8-bit distributor of software. I had written, I didn't really work for them, but I was a member of the Atari users group in Northridge, as were a lot of people who wrote software out there. And Datasoft was located in the same back of the same building, right in the same cul-de-sac as where we would have our meetings for the Atari users group. So I talked to, I think Pat Ketchum was the guy's name who owned Datasoft, about distributing. I'd written these software utilities, Graphic Master and Color Print, for my own use, and took them to him, and he thought they might be marketable, and they did. And I actually hit a pretty broad market with Graphic Master did pretty well. They marketed that. These were all disk-based, nothing cartridge-based, because there were utility programs where they had to do I/O. It needed the disk operating system, and it needed to be able to load and save pictures and printer interface and everything like that. So Datasoft was distributing those, and then I was continuing. That was really my hobby at the time. So writing software was just kind of what I did for fun. And I was still working as a sound mixer mainly in commercials. And one day we were working on a commercial. I think it was for members only jackets. Remember those?
I had one. Yeah,
members only jacket. I won't tell anyone. And who was the Anthony Geary was the spokesperson in this commercial, who was a big star of daytime soap operas at the time. He was, I think, in General Hospital, and that was the whole Luke and Laura phase of General Hospital. And so we were doing this commercial. I was mixing the sound, and my boom man was Lawrence Abrams at the time, and we had a teleprompter, which was the old-fashioned teleprompter, which were from QTV. Which was pretty much the only service bureau and one of the few manufacturers of teleprompting equipment at the time.
This was the scrolling paper deal? Right. And can you explain that to people who don't know about old-fashioned teleprompters? Can you give a quick tutorial about that?
Sure. The original, and I've worked with both. The original teleprompter was a really complex device and was built in suitcases and stuff, but later it was refined. They used cell and motors, which are synchronized DC motors that pulled tractor-fed paper up and down. It had two spools, a feed spool and a take-up spool, and a motor that would actually drive that paper. And to have these were used in soap operas occasionally and news telecasts. And you would type your script on something called a bulletin typewriter, which was like a regular typewriter, but with like half-inch high letters. So when you typed, it was, there's like 20 characters per line on a bulletin typewriter. So you'd have to type your text manually on this tractor feed paper and hope you didn't make any mistakes because it was a one long piece of paper. And then they would take that paper and load it onto the roller and the motor-driven thing. And then there were several of these. If there were several of these for different eye positions, for different eye contact where the actor would look to read his lines, they'd have to run in sync with each other. So these motors had to be synchronized together so that when you rolled them, they both stayed in sync, and the correct words were at the center of that was the original teleprompter. And those were very noisy, of course, because they had motors in the set. And so as a sound mixer, I kind of hated those because it was noisy and you could hear the paper rattling. And if the guy scrolled too far, it'd come off the end of the feed reel and you couldn't back up because we go whop, 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 whop. And so I did some Ford commercials with one of those with an old-time teleprompter operator who must have been in his 60s at the time. And I'm sure he's long now past. But Yeah, that was a constant problem. And then to make an edit in those days, you had to take each scroll off the roll, cross out stuff, and take white tape and hand write in changes and paste them over, or cut the paper up and tape it back together and hope that it didn't come apart. Well, then they transitioned once the small Vidicon tubes came around so that you could have a cheap a video camera, black and white video camera. They transitioned to a type it was kind of a hybrid that had a small video camera pointing down at a motorized belt. And that motorized belt moved horizontally and used also usually tractor-fed paper, or it could use it had a friction drive, so you could actually feed individual sheets of paper in there, and you didn't have to type on as big a typewriter because it had a video camera that was shooting.
I assume that video camera could be in the next room, so it would reduce noise.
Well, it could be anywhere. This device was about 3 feet by 4 feet in size. The video camera pointing straight down at this belt that moved the paper vertically. And then the output of the video camera was inverted, so it would be, instead of black on white, would be white text on a black background. And that feed was fed to a monitor which is attached to the camera, and the image is reversed so that image points up into a beam splitter, which is basically a partially silvered mirror. And so that the talent appears to be looking directly into the lens. This is for people who don't know what a teleprompter is. And so the talent appears to be looking directly into the lens and is really looking at a ghost image, kind of about a 30% reflection of the video monitor, whose image has been reversed, so they can read it correctly. Well, those units were a vast improvement because you didn't have to have synchronized motors, and if you made a mistake, you could pull the piece of paper out and write in with your hand easily, but you still had to cut and paste, and if the client changed their mind on a commercial or something, you had to wait while a guy retyped the script from scratch and then fed it back in, or retyped a portion of it and pasted it over the top of the paper. Mm-hmm. And since it was a linear device, if you had 20 pages of script and they wanted to go back to the top, you had to wait while a guy wound it backwards, and it didn't have a very high speed. It'd take a couple of minutes to get back to the top of the script. Or you had to go take it off completely and rewind it and put it back in at the beginning.
So do you remember the moment when you were just like, wow, my Atari computer could do this better?
Exactly. Well, so because I was the sound mixer and we're listening very carefully, and of course any sounds on the set that are distracting or could contaminate the dialogue we're trying to record, is we always try and stomp those things out. And we kept hearing the motor from the teleprompter that was pushing this paper through, humming and making noises, and you could hear it every time it moved, and the paper would rattle when it comes off the end. So I complained several times. We had made the guy move, further away. On a quiet soundstage, you can really hear it. And I was thinking, well, I know enough about graphics and computers and to maybe computerize this. And so at lunch, Lawrence and myself, my boom operator and myself, met with the prompter operator, and we asked him, I said, well, do you guys have any computer-based systems? And he said, oh, no, you could never do this on a computer. It's too, computers aren't fast enough to do this with. They don't have enough graphics power, and I don't think he knew that the Atari was kind of unique in the way that its graphics were constructed. It had a display list processor, which was really a high-end type of graphics processing at the time because memory was so short. It could process stuff on a line at a time, and using display list processing actually do things pretty fast instead of bit mapping, which is how it eventually went in the graphics world. And so with the guy from the biggest prompting company around saying that no, it wouldn't be possible, that was of course the impetus to of course make it possible. and so we conceived of it, and I wrote the code. Lawrence wasn't writing He was not a programmer. But he helped, and we worked out basically what it should do and what the user interface would look like. And I started writing code and developed. It took a while to get all the bugs out, but to develop a variable speed, smooth scrolling, bidirectional, smooth scrolling text was a little bit tricky, and it was not obvious on how to do it. And so I designed the hardware for it as well. I designed the camera mounts, and I designed the hand controller that could control it, so you could go forward and reverse and vary the speed continuously in real time, which is necessary for a teleprompter because you don't know how fast every person reads something differently, and if he's reading a bunch of numbers, like a telephone number or something, you got to hold because it takes a lot longer to read that number out than it appears on the screen. So you have to continuously vary the speed, and it has to scroll smoothly so that their eyes don't jump around and that so they don't get lost. So I worked on that and finally got the continuously variable smooth scrolling down, and the joystick. And the interface to the hand controller, which it built to go into the joystick ports and use the paddle input as an analog input for the speed control. And it also had, on the little hand controller, had a stopwatch built into the software so you could start, stop, and time segments. And the software had a variable position counter. All these things were unique at the time. So that you could see where you were constantly in the script from beginning to end, and it would, automatically calculate the length of the script and position itself where to show you, you're a third of the way through, half the way through, you're very near the end, etc. And some other aspects of Compu Prompt that we put in that you couldn't have with a mechanical system is bookmarks, the availability to set markers on the fly. So that if you wanted to come back, this is especially true in commercials where you'd do the same script 500 times, and you'd want to come back to the beginning, or let's pick it up at paragraph 2, and so you'd want to be able to jump back to that, and we set up ways with bookmarks that you could just hit a single key and pop instantly back to a bookmark that you'd previously set. So that speeded things up tremendously on the set, and when we first took it on the set and used it, the producers were amazed because they had scheduled, a full day of shooting, and, we got finished in 30 minutes because we could requeue. In the old fashioned, you'd have to wait for the thing to requeue, and everybody, they'd cut the camera, and everybody would walk around, and you'd lose concentration and stuff. And now with the computerized teleprompter, you could just go and again and start right away. So that kind of revolutionized the teleprompting industry, and so we decided to market it. But we went for a different marketing scheme, and the reason you don't see very many of them out there, the reason they're so rare and going on eBay for big amounts of money, is we only licensed it. We opened a prompting service business. We licensed it to a company called Dream Data, which was a company that myself and 2 other partners created to create game software, and they were going to license products. They were a producer and director in the film business, and they were going to procure the rights to motion pictures, and we were going to write games for motion, based on motion pictures. That was the concept. But they never did very well with that. My 2 business partners. I was going to develop the code, but they never came up with anything solid. That we had Texas Chainsaw Massacre for a brief period of time, and but nothing ever. They could never agree on anything. Yeah. So
what other titles were you looking at? Do you remember?
We did some stuff with Devo, but we never produced a game. And so when Dream Data, that company, never produced a game, I said, well, I have this teleprompter thing. Sorry. I took I said, well, I've got this. It's not game software or anything, but it's a vertical market piece of software that I've written. I said, maybe we could just, market that. And so I licensed it to the company, to Dream Data, of which I was a third partner in. So I'm licensing software to a company of which I'm a third partner. And so it was kind of a complex licensing situation. And so Dream Data, we decided to market it by license to other prompting service companies. And they set up a prompting service company to provide teleprompting services in Los Angeles and use the computerized software. At the time, we were the only computerized teleprompting service in town or anywhere. And so we licensed it to we opened up offices in Dallas, New York, San Francisco, Toronto, and Queensland, Australia, to do prompting services. And we would sell it to end users, but they had to sign a license agreement that said they could not use it to rent out to other people or set up a prompting service. They could only use it in-house. And so we sold systems to companies like IBM. We sold to JC Penney. We've sold them to the Defense Intelligence Agency of the government. A couple of television stations here and there. A variety of corporate entities that needed teleprompting for their internal use that didn't use it outside of their own personal use. And so those licenses were legal. And so it went along pretty well for about 4 or 5 years there. We were the only computerized teleprompting service and software out there. And our competitors, QTV and Telescript and the others were frantically working trying to duplicate what we had done. And eventually QTV tried to rip us off and hired a couple of programmers and licensed a piece of our software through a third party, crooked deal. And they hired 2 programmers to basically rip our software off and make their own. And they ended up, it became a total mess legal-wise. And I had to, it was not a nice time. I had to sue my 2 partners in Dream Data that had set up Compu Prompt and all the other prompting softwares decided, well, we could just take this.
From you?
Yeah, from me. And he'll have to sue us for copyright infringement. And he probably doesn't have the money. And we have the companies that are generating all this money to defend ourselves. And so that's basically what they did. They did like a hostile takeover. I was the president of the company, locked me out of the company one morning. I came and one of the 2 partners had put his brother in as the president, who was in the asphalt business. So he didn't know much about anything. But so, of course, Lawrence and I, who were on the copyright, had to then sue them for copyright infringement because they were continuing to use the software in the service businesses and try and sell it, although they didn't really know how to manufacture it. Another first for Compu Prompt was it was one of the first programs to use a digital dongle for protection.
I wanted to ask about that. It seemed like, based on what I could tell from the eBay listing, it seemed like you guys tried to lock this thing down against piracy hard. There was a cartridge which had a serial number on the cartridge, and there was a disc, and there was the dongle that you needed to keep people from. You needed to use it. Tell me about that.
Well, I developed a whole new, different way of writing software for the Atari. And my other 2 applications, which sold, were written in the same fashion, is using Atari Basic. I kind of developed a hybrid method of writing, a language, my own hybrid language. And I would use Atari Basic as a base to do all the I/O. Since these were productivity, all of them were productivity software, I'd use a Basic for just the typing in file names, loading and saving, setting parameters, setting variables and so on. Any of the user interface that required text on the screen and typing on behalf of text entry. But then all of the graphics routines were written in assembly language. And those were on disk or later stored in the cart, partially in the cart. But because memory was at such a premium, and these were all productivity, so any any byte that the program took up was one less byte of text or graphics that the user could load. So, you didn't want to limit, you didn't want to have too much of a limit on memory. So you had to squeeze every single byte out of the address space that you had to work in there to keep it open for the user's creations. And you only had 48K to begin with. So, and the basic ROMs took up 8K. And then DOS, the Atari DOS, took up some more space. So I was in there, throwing out routines from the basic ROMs that we didn't use and replacing them with my own. And I had to write, so I wrote the assembly language. To write it under Atari Basic, you had to write assembly language that was relocatable so that it could run anywhere in memory, which was really tricky on the 6502. And then I would stuff these assembly language routines into strings, and then Atari Basic could give you the address of where it stored the string. You didn't know where the string's going to end up in memory. It depends on how basic in the program. And so you could jump to the address of a string and execute code, which is how viruses operate today. But so it used that kind of hybrid language. So that made it very difficult to crack because it was a combination of the runtime routines from Atari Basic and my own assembly language routines, which were intermixed with those. And that made for a cartridge, which we could put a serial number in. And the digital dongle was, this software is probably one of the most expensive pieces of software sold that ran on the Atari because it made obsolete and worked a lot better and faster than the $12,000 mechanical video rig that was the thing it's competing against. So we could sell it for about $4,000 a copy for each copy of Compu Prompt.
I found an article in InfoWorld that said at the time in August '84 that the system would have the 800XL and the track disk drive and a monitor and the controller and the word processing software was $5,950, according to
Close. This. Yeah, right. And the software itself was around 4,000 of that.
Wow.
Well, we sold it with a computer and drive, and I think the computers at the time were like $149. So for under $1,000, we could assemble the hardware. But then and each piece of software was hand created for the licensee. So we couldn't create the software until we had a license signed. And we'd burn the user's name into the cartridges so they couldn't change, so you'd know when somebody ripped it off, we'd know who they stole it from. And there was also anti-piracy code in there that would check that username and, do checksums to make sure that nobody had changed it. But that didn't stop people from ripping us off.
That was my next question. Tell me, what happened?
Well, before, let's see, I think it was before we started selling it. The first guy we licensed it to, it didn't have the dongle protection on it, but it did have the burned-in cartridge with the name on it and so on, and he was licensing it. He was a local guy. He was licensing it to do services with, to run teleprompting services. And we were taking a percentage, we had to audit them and take a percentage. It was based on a royalty. So he'd be paying a royalty. So he was using our copy of the software, so we didn't have to protect it because he was under contract to provide. Well, of course, he quickly copied the software, hired somebody to go into the code and change all the names, change the name of the software in the code, and change the copyright notices to his name, and but the rest of the code was basically all mine. So we had to sue that guy for copyright infringement and take away his license and confiscate all of his equipment, and that took about a year and a half. And so after that, I developed the digital dongle to protect it as well, which was a trade secret. I developed it and didn't tell anybody what I did.
What did you do? Tell us.
I don't think I can. But no. I mean, up to that point, there had been dongles to protect some more expensive software, but they involved a pretty cheap method of just putting a resistor across a couple of the pins in in the joystick port, which you could, of course, read a value because they were, analog inputs. You could read the value of that resistance in the software and then determine if it was in a certain range that it's okay, the dongle is in and it's set to the right resistance. But of course, it's real easy to crack that because you take a multimeter, put it across a couple of pins and read the resistance out and make your own dongle, or use a potentiometer and set it to any level, turn it until it works.
I was just thinking you could just fiddle with the paddle until it worked. Yeah.
So that was crude, but was the only dongle that there was. So I developed a digital dongle that actually used logic, and I had to, it was a nightmare creating those. The little dongle was only about 3/4 of an inch long and had a 9-pin connector on the end of it to plug into the port. And those ports were both digital and analog. So you could send signals out and get signals back, 4 bits of digital for the joystick inputs. And so I would actually, when I built the dongle, I would store, by the way I wired it, store a serial number in it by the way it's wired. So it was serial number was hardwired into it. And you read it out, you could reset it and reset it, and it would have not readable output. All the bits would be set to 0. And then the software at a moment in time would send signals out to the dongle and run it through its readout, and so it would read back the number that was hardwired programmed into it, and it would read it back and compare it to the number in the cartridge, and if the two didn't match, it wouldn't run.
Nice.
So you couldn't, and it was all sealed in epoxy, so you couldn't really figure out what chip was in there or what, what the programmed number was, simply by testing it from the outside. So that worked pretty well. And that enabled us to sell it to a lot of, to IBM and people with a lot of highly technical people, Defense Intelligence Agency. And, it was kind of funny because I delivered it to Washington, D.C., and when we sold to the DIA, and my contact there, they were going to use it for debriefing spies. And when they came in, they would type up their findings, and then they would read them into a teleprompter. But they didn't want any printed copy of that stuff around. And so they would put it on the teleprompter, then they could easily destroy the digital file. But the guy I dealt with at the DIA's name was Spike Nail. I remember that.
It's a good spy name.
What a great name. I don't know if that was his real name, but it did say Spike on his on his uniform.
Nice.
But so we sold, and then later I realized that the government, we didn't have a GSA contract or anything, and they just bought this to use in their debriefing setup because there was nothing else like it. And later I read the Tempest requirements for any computer equipment used with the government or CIA or NSA, and incredible shielding requirements. And, of course, this was an off-the-shelf Atari computer. So
right.
I don't think it qualified, but they got away with it somehow. Anyway, so it was one of the first to use the digital dongle, and that protected it. And but when there was the takeover by the two nefarious partners, they hired a guy to try and crack my software protection because they couldn't produce any more. And he figured out how to make the same serial number and just copy the cartridges with that number, which we were using internally, and get it to work with that. And so they continued to use it and manufacture it, although I don't think they did any sales as a result of the lawsuit. It took 2.5 years for that lawsuit because one of the partners was just an idiot and refused to know when he was beaten. And we had to get an injunction. I mean, it was a long story. We had to they were continuing to use the software and use the money that they made from renting my software to other people to defend the lawsuit against me. So I was paying for the lawyers on both sides, basically.
Oh, lucky you.
Yeah. And so that was a hard 2 years and kind of turned me off to any kind of legal proceedings. And you learn something. You learn a really good lesson that there is no such thing as justice. There's only who has the most money and who holds out the longest. It's not about who's right. It's about who has the most money. Yeah. Because they can constantly delay and continue to use and use and use and use. So finally we got an injunction against them, and immediately before the injunction could be enacted, they took the company into bankruptcy, which of course protects it from all injunctions. And under Chapter 11 bankruptcy, they could continue to operate and use the equipment. So that was another two. Then we had to go to federal court, and I had to hire different lawyers. And, it was just a long, and eventually, we settled, and they gave everything back and stopped using it and got out of the business. But, and they sold that part of the business, part of their business to a company in Canada, a lawyer in Canada.
But by this time, I assume there were many other products and IBM PCs were available. And
right. IBM's we had the market for probably about 4 or 5 years. And then PCs finally, the graphics power of the PC finally came up to the point where you could do variable speed smooth scrolling. Although it was still quite difficult on those early EGA boards and stuff, and there was a guy, and I still know him and talk to him today, Jim Stringer, who wrote one of the first, he came up with first one that ran on the Commodore competitor, and a very smart guy. And then he eventually wrote a PC version for Telescript, and that's the software my company that I still have a prompting company in Los Angeles that does teleprompting. In fact, I got a guy out today doing something with a very big celebrity under a big hush hush commercial I can't talk about. Just have the non-disclosure agreement right there. But he's out today using it, and but we use the Telescript software now, which Jim Stringer wrote. He was out of Lawrence, Kansas. And I was able to, I decided I didn't want to be in that market to sell anymore because it was so cutthroat and so competitive and so vertical. And so, it was not that big a market to begin with. And to stay ahead, it just took too much time from my regular job. It was just a hobby to me, remember? So I formed ProPrompt at the time of the lawsuit so that I could continue to market Compu Prompt, my own software, but I had to change the name because they were still using Compu Prompt as the name of their company illegally. I owned the trademark as well.
So what did you change the product name to?
We used Compu Prompt as the product name, but we operated under the name ProPrompt as the service company. See, because they were using Compu Prompt as the name of their service company. And during the lawsuit, so we could continue to operate a prompting company and get income from using Compu Prompt, they couldn't sue me for copyright infringement. But I couldn't operate under the name Compu Prompt because having two companies named Compu Prompt in the same city would be very confusing. We would lose a lot of business to them. So we had to compete against my own product with my own product. So it was that, and that was all during the lawsuit. So that was 2 years. And so at the end of the 2 years, when we finally got them to give up, it didn't make much sense to go back to renaming the company Prompt because all the bad will that they generated while running the company, we didn't want to inherit that. So we just continued to use ProPrompt as the name of the company, and we continued to use Compu Prompt for a number of years until we switched over to Telescript after the IBMs, became viable and that took a long time. And thankfully, Jim Stringer listened to me, and I would give him, requirements. I said, well, if we're going to use this software, it has to do this, and so he put stuff into it that. Was basically, what I would have in a PC-based teleprompting system, and so at least I was able to get their product to do what I wanted it to do. So
I understand you won an Emmy for Compu Prompt. Was it for the Atari version? And is that it behind you?
That is it. That is it back there. It is Compu Prompt won an Emmy for pioneering development. I think they gave it to us in 2009. Well, they gave it to, the ceremony was in 2010, and Jerry Lewis was the host of it. So that was kind of a trip to have Jerry Lewis present that Emmy to me. But yeah, Compu Prompt won an Emmy for pioneering development in the field of electronic prompting.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
Yeah. And it only took them 20 years. But yeah, so it's probably the only piece of Atari 8-bit software to win an Emmy.
Probably.
Now, actually, there may be another piece. There was a piece of software, I think it was nominated for a technical Emmy. I don't know if it ever got one. That was guy wrote. I met him. Wrote another piece of vertical market software that did timings. Used the synthesizer in the Atari 8-bit machines to do breakdowns and timings for music, for composers to do scores with. So you could it would set a metronome pace, and it could break it down and could change pace at certain points in time. And so he wrote a little utility to do that. And I think, and a lot of composers used that in the 80s to time out pieces of music with complex rhythm patterns and complex time signatures.
SMTPE was a thing.
Well, SMPTE, you mean SMPTE?
Yes.
Well, before time code was probably used, broadly. Yeah. I'm a member of SMPTE as well. And there's another little plaque back there that's a lifetime member. But yeah, before time code was popular, computers were being used as tools in the industry quite a bit behind the scenes, besides their gaming aspects, and that's why I always looked at computers to be used as a tool and not necessarily just a distraction. Mm-hmm. I never really was into games that much. I liked Star Raiders, and because of their 3D, it was one of the first kind of depictions of 3D space on a computer, and I like that and some of the LucasArts products. And then I transitioned to different, the Amiga and the Mindset computer. I still have a Mindset computer. I should see if that's worth anything.
Wow, yeah.
Probably is. Mindset, if you know about Mindset, was the computer that Jay Miner, who did the chipset on the Atari 8-bit machines, was hired off, and he did the Amigas, and before that he did the Mindset computer, which was similar graphics capabilities, and mindsets were used a lot in Hollywood. They a lot of game shows that had to have computer generated graphics used the mindset to generate, because it had a genlockable output, standard video output on it, and it had a much denser color palette than the Ataris did, and so you could do computerized graphics. And I think there were couple of shows I didn't work on, but worked around, that used the mindset in the late 80s, early 90s.
I didn't know that. Nice.
But yeah, I'm still, and I just realized a strange thing. I'm sitting right now in the exact same spot I was sitting when I wrote Compu Prompt in 1982.
Nice.
Right here in my little computer workstation in the living room,
wow.
Which is, I've kept as a computer workstation. Computers have changed over the years.
Do you have any of the stuff, the software, the hardware? Do you own anything?
Oh yeah, I still have. I kept one full Compu Prompt system, and it was all built into cases. I designed these really unique cases that would come apart and go back together in the shape of a console, because they had to use CRT monitors and the disk drive and the Atari 800, and it would lock up and you could throw them on an airplane and ship them anywhere, and it would arrive intact. And so I still have one of those, I think one or two maybe. I still have two of those systems that we had in our rental business that are kept in pretty good shape. I haven't tried to boot them up in a number of years. They're in storage, but I should probably go out and boot that in case the Smithsonian ever calls and wants to have a copy. I have an intact one.
The National Association of Broadcasting or something might want it.
Yes, for their museum or something.
Do you have the source code or anything?
I do. I'm looking over at the bookshelf. I think I do have printouts of the original source code. It's difficult because, like I say, the assembly language stuff was written, so it was a combo. So there's a basic source code, and then there's assembly language source code, and the assembly language stuff was compiled into strings, which get converted to characters. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of hard to interpret these days. And I think I have some of the original source code. I was going through unfortunately, in the last month or so, my storage facility where I've stored a lot of this stuff over the years that hadn't been used in years. As of course they're tearing it down. A hedge fund company bought the property and they're turning it into condos, and so I have to get everything out within a month and a half. So I was going through my storeroom, which is how this copy ended up on eBay. I didn't realize there was one in there when I told a kid to go through and sell off some of the Atari stuff, and he didn't realize that there was a copy of Compu Prompt in there and sold it to someone. And but I've kept all the rest of them, I think. They're around somewhere. They're in one of those boxes. So, and I think I do have the source code still, but I don't know if I'd ever be able to, because you have to burn a cartridge and create the dongle, and
Yeah. Well, I would like to highly encourage you to release what you have, even if it's on paper, whatever you've got. People can, if they're interested, reverse engineer it, probably get past your. A few years have passed, and it's possible to. There's new technologies for breaking things.
The trademark and the copyright are still valid, by the way. I've kept the trademark alive. Awesome. I still own the trademark, and I still own of course, the copyright, thanks to Walt Disney.
Right, yeah.
The trademark will go on to 75 years after I'm dead, but
copyright will last until the end of time.
I mean, the copyright will.
Yeah.
Go on until 75 years after I'm dead. The trademark has to be renewed every 10 years. So when I stop renewing that, that'll come up again. But so I still have to look for people using the name illegally. But I don't know if a Graphic Master, now that might be a little more releasable.
Yeah, we didn't really talk about that. We talked about color print a lot. Tell me about Graphic Master and how you came up with it and how you created it.
Well, I was kind of frustrated by the drawing programs at the time in the early 80s were basically joystick based. And there was Micro Painter, I think, from was that Datasoft? I can't remember whether that was Datasoft or somebody else's, but and there's
I want to say Datasoft, but I'm not positive.
Yeah, there was Micro Painter, and basically it let you draw with the joystick, which you had up, down, left, right, and diagonals, and that was basically all the directions you could draw with. There was no pen input. There was no, so to create graphics, you had to draw, and you could flood fill with the color. So once you created an enclosed area, you could fill it with a color. So Micro Painter was just basically those two routines, drawing and filling, and drawing and filling, drawing, filling, choosing color, and then you could save it off. But there weren't any print routines in that. So I was frustrated that you couldn't save stuff easily, and that you couldn't edit. So I came up with the idea of, wouldn't it be great if you could cut and paste or manipulate stuff within a certain area without affecting the other area? And so I started working on that and writing assembly language routines to do those bit manipulations and to do masking and stuff to preserve colors. And the Atari in mode 8, which was a single pixel based, the Atari output was only fed to a television set. And because of the quirks of the way televisions were designed at the time, if you output mode 8 was strictly black and white. It was strictly pixel was on or pixel was off. It didn't have any color. And it was a limited bitmap. I can't remember, what was it,
320 by something. Anyway, yeah.
So you had a limited number of pixels, but
you cheat by artifacting.
Yeah, you cheat by artifacting. So you could achieve color by depending upon where that pixel was horizontally on the screen, and depending upon the design of your monitor. because trinitrons were different than regular triad-based CRTs. You'd end up with different colors. And so my software took that into account, the artifacting into account, and actually did masking based on bit positions. So you could leave the background transparent and just take the colors and overlay them over other pieces of graphics. So you could copy a piece of software from the screen, a design from the screen, and move it around and paste it back on top of another design. So you could kind of construct stuff that way. And then I set it up with a dual screen buffer so that you'd have two screens to work on. You'd have a palette screen and then a drawing screen, so that you could load different palettes into the palette screen and copy, it was kind of like Visio or, where you'd have pre-drawn designs which you could save as a palette, and then you could cut and paste those, or you could overlay whole screens, and then bit manipulation within the program. You could take different size windows to cut and paste with, and you could shift things one bit at a time, which would change their colors, or shift them 2 bits at a time, which would keep their colors intact, or skew them, or flip them vertically or horizontally, or you could rotate them 90-degree increments. You could do that kind of manipulation. And there was nothing really out there that did any of that at the time. So I wrote that in BASIC with a lot of assembly language routines for all the bitmap manipulation. And that's where I developed that concept of that hybrid language. And, when it was, BASIC was poo-pooed as a language to write in because, it was an interpreted language, and so it was very slow on most machines. And you got to remember, these were 1 megahertz machines. So doing bitmap graphics is pretty, CPU intensive. But when you're writing an assembly language, you can blaze and do a lot of that stuff, in the blink of an eye. Yeah, so all the bit manipulation stuff was assembly language coded and stuffed into strings. So I would call them when needed to do a scan or a bit flip or invert. And it also involved text. So you could put text on the screen in a Mode 8 graphics mode, which was originally just bitmapped. So it would take the bitmap from the character generator and map those as characters and put them on the screen in the bitmap. So it lets you mix text and graphics. That was another thing that you couldn't really do with any of the other graphics editors. So I wrote this, and I took it to, I think, the Atari users group and showed it to somebody, and they were kind of floored that a BASIC program could do this. And I had to explain to them, well, it's not really BASIC, but it does require the BASIC cartridge to run because I'm using their routines. Mm-hmm. So the guy at Datasoft said he wanted to distribute it, and so that's when I signed a contract with them to distribute it. And so I took it to them as, I wrote them had to write the manual and everything for it myself and generate the code, and they just distributed it and gave me royalties. So.
How did it do for you?
I did a pretty good living. I made a couple of $100,000 off of that program.
Nice.
It sold well, and color print.
I was going to say, better than color print, I would guess.
Well, color print I came up with next. That was the next product because I wanted to come up with a way. I had to write the printer drivers to print out from Graphic Master, and you had to write it for each printer because each printer was different, and they were all 9-pin or 9-pin dot matrix at the time, 8 or 9-pin. And so that was tricky. And then I don't know if I ever wrote I don't think I wrote a laser printer. Later, I wrote laser printer drivers for Compu Prompt, I think. But so I had to, write all those graphics routines to get it out to the graph tracks. What do they call it? Graph tracks? Epson had a method of printing out a bitmap, because it was a character-based printer primarily, dot matrix printer, but it did have a graphics mode you could go into called graph tracks. And so you could spit out graphics to it, but I think it was inverted or something. So I had to go through a lot of bitmap manipulation stuff just to get the graphics out to the printer. Mm-hmm. And so in the process of doing that, I thought about this color idea. And so I came out with color print and the color carbon paper. Then the carbon paper company we were buying the colored carbon paper from went belly up. So we didn't have, and because they were selling a stock that had been sitting on shelves for years, there wasn't really a market for red carbon paper or green carbon paper, yellow carbon paper.
Right.
Yellow on white is not a good carbon. And so finding those colors was difficult or impossible. And after a short period of time, I think Epson saw what was going on, and they came out with the color ribbon dot matrix printers that had 4-stripe color ribbon that would move the ribbon up and down to generate the different colors.
So did you change your software to work with that?
No, by then I didn't change color print because it was kind of a unique thing at the time. By then, IBM PCs had pretty much taken over the market for any kind of text or graphics, and it wasn't until then that Epson came around to figuring out that you could do color graphics or at least color text printing on a dot matrix printer. And shortly after that, laser printers kind of took over. So everything went back to black and white again.
Yeah, right.
So it wouldn't have been if I had taken the time to write it for the color printers, for the color ribbon printers, then it would have been. I think Datasoft was out of business by that time anyway, so I would have had to find a new distributor. So,
did you do any other software besides the ones we've talked about?
Yeah, I've written. It's all utility software. I've written and marketed a number of utilities over the years. On the PC, I did something called BWF Widget. If you look, you can find that on the internet. You can download it. It's for being a sound engineer. It's designed for broadcast wave files. When we started recording on disk, digital files on disk, they recorded in broadcast wave file format, which had time code embedded in it in a very stupid way. Thank you, SMPTE. Actually, it was the EUE. It was the Europeans that foisted that off on us. But there was a lot of confusion in the marketplace over time code because there were different flavors. It was the time code embedding in files was done in the EU, where they work at integer frame rates of 25, and in the United States we worked at 2997 first. Thank you, SMPTE. And fractional frame rates. And so there was always this confusion as to, time doesn't really run in real time, and under SMPTE it runs in SMPTE time, which is 0.1% slower than real time. So you had to take all these gyrations and calculations into effect. So there was a lot of confusion and playing back time codes. It was in playing back file-based time code stuff. And you could always play it back on the machine that recorded it and see the time code. But if you wanted to play it back on your computer could play back the sound just fine, but it couldn't display the time code. So you couldn't play anything back with time code and see the time code as you're playing it back. So I wrote a piece of software to do that, to play it back and read the time code and put a display on the screen with a time code readout. And then I just evolved that to do a lot of stuff to be able to manipulate the metadata within the broadcast wave file. So you could change the frame rate and the time code speed, and you could, speed it up, slow it down. And you had to go through all these gyrations. You had to do a 0.1% slowdown to match it up to video. You had to do a 0.1% speed up to go back to film rate. And it did all of that stuff. So I published that utility, I don't know, about 10, 12 years, 11 years ago. It's still available. You can still download it. And I still get a few downloads here and there. And people buy it. So that's a nice surprise. My PayPal account pops up. Oh, look, somebody else brought another copy of WIF Widget. I haven't updated. I licensed it to Sound Devices years ago, and they came up with their own version, Wave Agent, which they were going to give away. They did the nice thing and licensed my software from me, and I sent them the source code. And so, and they hired someone to write basically a version that would be multi-platform, so that they could run on the Mac or the PC. So I have them to thank for that. But my software still does a few things that theirs doesn't do, so they let me keep it on the market because there are people that use it for transcription. And then I wrote something called TC Transcriber, which is along the same lines, which lets you take the time code. And I kind of came up with a way of embedding time code in MP3 files in the header using the ID3 tags, and just kind of developed a standard, and all the manufacturers kind of picked up on that as a standard now, and all the MP3 files that are recorded on these professional recorders in MP3 format that have timecode recorders now embedded in the format that I created originally. So that that MP3 way of storing timecode allowed transcription people to take broadcast wave files, which are very big, and crush them down to 1/10 the size into an MP3 with timecode in the header, so that the transcriptionists can take the original timecode and relate the transcription back to the timecode of the original broadcast wave file without having to send, multi-megabyte files over the internet. So a lot of transcription houses around the world are still using BWF widget or TC transcriber for playing back their files. And I continue to work, or actually I'm retired, but occasionally I work. I transitioned from sound into video and computer playback. That's a whole nother podcast. But I did the computer wrangling on a lot of mainly on television commercials for decades. Excuse me. I did all of Apple's television commercials for years. I had to recreate the HAL computer for one of their Super Bowl spots one year. Cool. And the big secret is that, the funny thing is that I did, was the hardware wrangler and create a lot of the software imagery and stuff that was used in all the Mac commercials up through about 2005, somewhere like that is when I stopped doing them. But I used PCs a lot.
No.
Yeah, when I recreated the HAL computer, it was actually 4 PCs that I had built. They were running on the screens. No Macs were used in the creation of that spot. Don't tell Steve Jobs, but he's dead. So
yeah, you're killing me.
We had to. The agency. I worked very closely with Shite Day and the agency that did all the Apple commercials. Because I had to recreate all their stuff, and I did all their screen graphics and stuff for all the stuff that was included in their commercials over the years. Screen capture, and I did 24 frame playback. So I transitioned into that, doing computer graphics on commercials, where people are interacting, interactive computer graphics, where there had to be a computer on the set and the actor had to interact with it, and it appeared to go to a website or, which of course usually didn't exist when we were shooting the commercial, or, do something that the computer hadn't been done yet. I did all of Microsoft's commercials and Compaq and Hewlett Packard and Packard Bell. Remember them?
I know the Packard Bell.
Yeah.
It's like 75 megahertz. It's super fast.
Yeah. So I did all the interactive graphics and 24 frame sync. So at the time they were all CRTs and had to be synchronized with the camera shutter. So that's kind of a black art in itself. And so I did that for many years, and because the pay was actually better doing that than it was being a production sound mixer on commercials. So I could really name my own rate because it was a very limited field. There were only about 4 or 5 guys that knew how to do that stuff in town, and I got a lot of work out of it. And continued to do video playback. In fact, I was the video playback computer and video playback guy on the show Dexter for 6 years. And Desperate Housewives. And I worked on a number of TV shows over there. In fact, today, if I weren't here talking to you, I'd be on Shameless, Showtime series.
Sorry to keep you from
Well, they called last night and go, "Oh, can you come do Shameless tomorrow?" And I went, "Oh, yeah, I got this thing at 10 o'clock." And they went, "Oh, well, I guess you can't."
Sorry.
That's all right. I can only now that I'm officially retired, I can only work 4 days a month anyway. So, and keep my lovely union pension. But I still stay active in the union. So
good. So what do you do to entertain yourself when you're the other 26 days a year, a month?
Well, I still write software. In fact, because I do video playback over the years, and I just retired this year. I've developed tools that I use myself, utilities for doing video playback. So it's another vertical market application, and it's basically video players that do a variety of unique things that you need in a video player if you're doing on-set playback, where you need like the teleprompter, where you need to recue to a specific spot instantly and go again. If the director says, no, you blew that line, take it again. Then you've got to recue all the videos. And so I developed a way, and sometimes I did one a couple of weeks ago for Adobe that involved a launch. It was called Launch, I think was the name of the spot. It was like a 2-minute spot. And we retrofitted a launch control thing called Sea Launch, which is down in Long Beach down here, which is a ship that has a launch platform. There's a huge platform that's built in an oil rig drilling platform that they send out that they can launch rockets off of into space. And they have a control room that's built, it's owned by the Swedes and the Russians, I think. And so they have these 2 control rooms on the tender ship, which is a destroyer-sized ship. They're built into the ship, and they have, of course, consoles full of racks of monitors and stuff. So we had to use that for this Adobe spot. And so all these monitors had to be showing all this, tracking software and launch information software and all the consoles, and big screens on one side and showing, tracking and weather and things like that. So I had to create all the screens for that. And at one point in the commercial, they all have to go dark. They all have to black out. Now I've got 47 monitors in that set with being fed graphics of some sort from probably about 15 sources. And they all have to go dark at the same time on cue. And that's not an easy task to do, especially since it's built into consoles that are, welded onto a ship. You have a limited number of ways you can have access to these monitors, and we couldn't connect to any of their computers. We had to disconnect the monitors from all their computers, hook up our own feeds to all their computers, and then have all those feeds on cue go dark, and then come back without having to wait for computers to reboot or anything like that. So it's quite an undertaking, and thanks to my software, I was able to do this. I had myself and one assistant to make all these things go black on cue and then come back up and be able to do another take almost instantly after that. So my software, I'm getting ready to market to playback guys a toolkit that has 5 different playback softwares that I've written that do unique things. I've got one that does that, and people don't realize this, that some of this new hardware, let's see if I got one here. Somewhere over here. These new stick PCs. I don't know if you can see that. This is a Quantum Access stick PC. That's an entire Windows 8 or Windows 10, I think I am on this one, computer built into something the size of a chiclet box. Has HDMI out. So I've put my software on these as software protection and tied it to the ROM-based ID in this unit.
Old habits die hard, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Well, like I say, this is a very limited market. And if I were to, I've always kept this software for myself to give me a little competitive edge in the market, because there's a lot of other companies, there are a few other companies that do video playback. And, but now that I'm retired, I think, well, maybe I'll share. So, and I thought, well, if I sell one copy, that's going to be it. Because it'll get passed around, or, hey, yeah, I got that program that lets you do this. Yeah, okay, sure. Here, can I get a copy of that? So I'm going to tie it to, I'm going to sell these for about the price of a Mac Mini, because everybody uses Mac Minis, as sources these days for playback. And that's a very expensive option because you're paying the Mac tax of, an extra $400 per computer to go into Mac's extremely large coffers. But something like this, which can sell for around $130, gives you full high-def playback. In fact, with these Atom-based processors, the 3735 that's in here, you can play back 9 high-def video streams simultaneously.
Wow.
I was flabbergasted. I have MacBook Pros. I have, Retina, MacBook Retina. I can play back maybe 4 streams, and it starts to stutter on my MacBook. These little things will do 10. Sometimes 12, depending upon how hot you want it to get. There's no fans, that's the other thing for using on set. They're very handy because they make no noise. They're all solid state. They can sit behind a monitor, a TV, plugs into any TV with HDMI, and you can deliver, has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth built in, a little antenna there. So I can control them all with my software over Wi-Fi, so I can start, stop, reset, go to black, do all of those things from my software over Wi-Fi. So you just plug this into the back of the TV, you load your files in that you want to use, and go to town. So that's my next. That's what I've been working on in my spare time, my hobby time.
Awesome. I want to go back. We were talking earlier about the dongle on the Atari and the hardware you did there, but we didn't really talk about the hand controller for the Compu Prompt, and I think that's an interesting thing. It looks like it's about the size of a deck of cards. It's bright orange. It's got a slider and a button on it, and how did you create them? Were they hand built, or did you have?
They were. I built every single one of them myself.
Wow. How many is every single one? How many of these things did you? I mean, we're talking a dozen. Are we talking 200, 1,000?
A couple of close to 1,000 probably. Maybe a couple of hundred. I mean, maybe 500 or 600. I can't remember in the lawsuits and and all that mess. And they went through gyrations. Those little boxes those are built in. I can't remember who made them. They were Cal something. Great little boxes. I had built another piece of hardware for use in the sound business called that was a remote control for the Nagra recorders. That was in that same box. That was and it had a lot crammed into it. It had remote start stop for the Nagra. It had a slate button, had a slate microphone. It had a headphone amplifier, and with volume controls and slate levels, so you could slate takes, and it would automatically roll the Nagra when you did a slate, but it wouldn't, and would shut it off when you let go of the mic. And it had a bunch of features on it, but it was all crammed in that little box. It had to have a mic and a mic preamp and a headphone amplifier and volume controls and everything else. So I learned how to build stuff pretty small into that size box. I had a lot of those boxes laying around, so I thought, well, I need a potentiometer, which is a slide control for easily controlling the speed of the text in the Compu Prompt. And I put in a couple of switches to start, stop, which I read off of the joystick control, so that the nice thing about the Atari 8-bits is they had one plug, that 9-pin plug, had both analog and digital inputs on it. And you could read back both simultaneously. So, I read the analog resistance off the speed control, and then the switches, I think, were all digital to do start, stop, reset, and direction control. So that was all that was really in the hand controller. But all that stuff had to be read in real time because of the variable speed smooth scrolling. You had to read that stuff during VBlank, so you had a very limited amount of time to read the hand controller. And that was all assembly language coded, so that I could, read back the condition of those switches every 60th of a second and update the speed of the scroll accordingly in the direction and so on. Which was kind of tricky in the Atari because the way they mapped memory with a displayless controller, you had 4K chunks of RAM you had to deal with, and they didn't. Atari, in their wisdom, said, well, let's not use expensive counters to do the line counters here for the video. We'll just use 3 bits of counters, and then the other 3 will be registers so that you can store a register in there. And so to put the address of graphics RAM, you had to deal with half of the address would be counters, which you could increment, and the other half would be registers. So when you jumped over a 4K boundary, you had to reset the registers, and it was a bit of a nightmare. That's, I think, one thing that gave us an edge and let us stay on the market. It took other people a long time to figure out, to do the variable speed and to manage the boundary jumping to keep this text from glitching when it crossed a boundary. Had to all be managed because you had to count every single line, and you had to, you had to keep there's a lot of accounting that had to be done within the software to maintain everything was pixel smooth in either direction. You could change direction, and it would behave just like paper on the screen. And that was one other thing of the advantage. The Atari was one of the only chipsets that had a large font mode, which had 20 characters per line, I think. And we used that large font mode as the primary mode for the teleprompter. So it gave us a large character size, which we could smooth scroll by using tricks inside the display list, without having to do double buffering or anything that you would do with normal bitmap graphics. And it also allowed us to have different size font on one line, and then large font scrolling area, and then player missile graphics at the bottom to do the variable position indicator and mark the bookmarks. So that you would have a start mark, and you would see a little visual indication on the screen of where the start mark was, and you'd know when you hit requeue, you weren't back at the beginning, you were at a mark that was some way, 3/4 of the way down or something. So it gave you a lot of visual information. And we were able to, since we built the monitors that go on the camera mount, we were able to take, and they were, analog CRTs, we could adjust the height of the display to scan off on the person who's reading the prompters so they're not distracted by the timer or the relative position pointer. So that only the operator would see those.
Oh, neat. So it's sort of like, because the hardware could generally run one monitor at once, but you could make it act like there was a something that the talent saw and something the operator saw, and it was slightly different. That's nice.
Slightly different, yeah. Uh-huh. So it would basically mask off and stretch the height of the text and make it a little bit bigger. And so we would automatically have I'd modify the monitors. I came up with all that too. We had to put resistors and go into the monitors and actually modify the vertical height of the scan. And of course, you had to also reverse the scan left-right in the monitors so that it would be showing a mirror image of what the operator sees, so that when it's reflected in the beam splitter, it reads correctly. So all of our monitors are modified with a switch to control image. They could go either reverse or normal, and overscan or non-overscan. So there was 2 switches we put on the monitors for doing that. That allowed us to put just the text on the screen for the talent to see, so they weren't distracted by the other stuff. Yet the operator could see the timer and the relative position and all that.
Awesome. What haven't I asked you about the Atari days that I should have?
Well, let's see. I think that's about it. What's the interest been in? I was surprised at the amount of money that the software went for on eBay as well, because I guess it is a collectible. It is very rare. And since we really didn't sell them to end users, we licensed them, that really limits the sales. So I guess the collectability is such that, and as far as being of value, I guess if the person who bought the dongle and the hand controller and the disc and the cartridge could get it up and running, hopefully it still runs. We also later on in the Atari years, when they came out with software-based hard drives, in our office, we always ran it, had it stored in ROM. Had it stored in flash RAM. On the
when you say software-based hard drives, you mean like RAM disks?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, there was, can't remember who made it. There was some company, third party, who made a RAM disk that plugged into the accessory connector on the back, expansion connector on the back, and would emulate basically a Atari 810 hard drive, but would store multiple disks worth of information, so that you could, and it was, as long as you didn't power it down, have that information available. So you could boot off of that, which was a lot faster, as well as load, software off of that. So we used those in our office for going back and forth. And I had to write software, once the IBM was around, people were starting to use IBMs and Macs for text creation. We had to translate everything into Atari ASCII, which was different than ASCII on the IBMs or the Macintosh. Macintosh had their own ASCII, and so it was I wrote software, the ProPrompt transfer software, which was software that ran on an IBM and on the Atari, and connected via RS-232. So it would take Word files in and WordPerfect files in on the IBM side, convert them to a TASCII and shoot them over the serial port into the Atari, where they could then be saved on an Atari disk, which became, that became problematic for us, which is why we eventually switched to IBM-based software because, just dealing with, somebody shows up on set with a disk going, oh, I have we rewrote the scripts on the way to the shoot today, and here they are on this disk. And it's like, oh, okay, well, I got to get on my PC, and I got to boot that up, and I got to transfer the stuff over into the TASCII, or I had to just retype it into the Atari, into our Compu Prompt software. So the interface between the Atari world and the rest of the IBM world became too difficult to manage to even continue on in that vein.
Do you have a sense of how long that the last Atari running Compu Prompt, how long did it go before someone just finally, you hear stories about like somewhere there's a school district that's the
I don't know,
entire environmental system for the school is still running on an Amiga today. Just wondering.
There are people out there that are doing that stuff. I don't think there's anybody left with the Atari. Since the hardware hasn't been supported in, a couple of decades, it'd be hard for them to keep stuff running. And I know I haven't gotten any letters from people who want warranty service or anything lately. They were used we were using it up until the 90s, the mid-90s, I think. As our primary prompting software, and I guess some of the licensees that were still using it in Dallas, I think they were using it at TextPrompt in a couple of places. And I don't know about Australia since I never went there. There was a guy in Queensland we licensed it to, and he used it for years. And I don't know how long he continued to use it after after the big shakeup. And a lot of the records were lost as a result of that lawsuit and, a hostile takeover. So they destroyed a lot of stuff. And so it's hard to keep up with a lot of those records. They seized a lot of those records and, I didn't have access to them. So I'm not sure. I suppose it could be. I'll have to.
I didn't expect you'd know, but it's, fun to ask. So.
On some day when I'm really bored, I'll have to open up that system, that rental system that I have, and see if it'll still boot. In fact, I've got a PC sitting right next to me here. I'm working on which is my old desktop computer. It's a PC that's a i7 that I built. But, I thought, well, I got it out of storage, and I said, well, let me see if it'll reboot. I used it for editing video and things like that. So it was a pretty hefty system. It had, SDI ins and outs on it and everything from Blackmagic, but it wouldn't boot. And so I've been messing with it. And I just put a new power supply on it and got it to boot yesterday. So it's still running Windows 7. So I had updated it to Windows 7. But I thought, well, maybe I'll upgrade it to Windows 10 because I can.
Well, if you get the Compu Prompt running, shoot some video. I'd love to see it in action.
Okay.
That'd be awesome.
It'll do. And I'm sure Graphic Master is probably available somewhere on one of the download sites. I do have the discs for that. In cleaning out the storeroom this week to move to a new storeroom, I was going through a bunch of stuff and found a lot of Atari discs. Of course, I don't have any drives set up to even look at them or read them anymore. So.
I do.
Yeah,
and
really?
I can move them to modern to SD cards easily, and then you can run it in an emulator, and super easy for me to do.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, so you've emulated the 810 drive, or?
Yeah, well, I have a gadget.
1050, or yeah.
I have a gadget that plugs into the 810 drive that you plug an SD card into that. So the Atari thinks this SD card is another floppy drive. So then you can just go copy from disk 1 to disk 2, and the Atari's like, okay, and it doesn't know it's using crazy future technology. Mm-hmm. And then after that's done, you walk it over to your Mac, plug it in, and
so your emulator runs on the Mac primarily, or?
I have a Mac emulator. There are also Windows versions.
Okay.
Yeah, there's one called Atari 800. There's one called Altera. And they're very, very solid emulations of the Atari machines.
And do they emulate the joystick controls as well, or? Mm-hmm. And what do they use for that? Just USB-based hand controllers, or?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or keyboard controls.
Yeah, or keyboard controls, right? And there's a company or two that makes USB Atari joysticks that look just like the ones from back in the day.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting.
So anyway, if you want to, lend me those discs. I will be happy to recover anything that's trapped on old media for you.
I'm sure you can find somebody with a distribution disc for. I'm sure they're floating around there on the internet.
Oh yeah, the distribution discs are probably easy, but if you have, I don't know, source code or anything that wasn't widely released.
Yeah, like I say, it's hybrid code, so I don't think it could do anybody any. Reconstructing it from the source code would be very difficult, if not possible. Even I would have a hard time doing it. So
I know it's absolutely impossible if we don't have the information. So anyway, the entire community is there are a few thousand of us who some of us like projects like that. So
it's interesting. I kind of like that you guys are keeping the 8-bits alive. I haven't seen. Is there a 16-bit Atari ST groups as well, or is it mainly the fascination with the 8-bits?
No, there's definitely ST groups. I don't personally know much about them because I'm not an ST guy. But there are forums and websites.
I had an ST, but I wasn't really happy what Tremail did with the company and the direction they took with those machines.
Yeah. And
by then I had transitioned to the mindset, which was kind of MS-DOS based. It ran a version of MS-DOS.
Huh. I haven't gotten to play with one of those yet.
Well, I got one. If you want to reconstruct it, I'll donate it.
Excellent.
It's I still have a few 800s kicking around and some 810 drives. And I think I got rid of all of them. Some happy drives. And all my 810s, I think, had been converted for high-speed I/O, dual-speed I/O. And increased the RAM to 256K on them, which you could do.
Nice.
But if I do, I'll let you know.
Cool. Thanks. This was great. Thank you so much for your time today.
All right. My pleasure.
If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.